fortress on the sea, a military base capable of crushing a European nation in the blink of an eye, the immense capacity and cutting-edge arsenal of the world's balancing power, the most powerful fleet on the planet, ruler of the Pacific Ocean, with 170 warships, aircraft carriers, cruisers, and over 400 aircraft of all types. Yet in less than 3 hours, it was beaten to smithereens, becoming the greatest humiliation in U.S. history, an event that shifted the entire course of World War II, the Battle of Pearl Harbor. In the early 1,930 seconds, as capitalist ruling classes began shifting toward militaristic ultranationalism, the Japanese had never before shown their ambitions so clearly. What they wanted was not just a prosperous nation, it was the dream of dominating the entire Asia-Pacific region. From a small nation on the shores of the East China Sea, they sent troops to conquer a vast strip of East Asia, starting with Manchuria, China. The Second Sino-Japanese War broke out in 1937. In December of that same year, the most powerful army of the land of the rising sun captured Nanjing, the capital of the Chinese Nationalist Party. Here they committed a massacre and mass rape, a stain on history that left nearly 3,000,000 dead. Not stopping there, Japan continued to expand its expansionism into the Russian Far East, Korea, and countries in Southeast Asia, territories then controlled by Britain and the United States. Japan's tyrannical actions greatly irritated the nation considered the top of the global food chain at the time. Washington began passing a series of economic sanctions against Japan, including freezing assets and placing trade embargoes on items such as aircraft metals and especially oil. With their 6 million tons of oil reserves dwindling day by day and raw materials for war unmet, Japanese-American tensions escalated at a dizzying pace. This was especially true when Japan dared to join the Axis powers, Germany, Italy, forming a trio provoking the Allies. At this point, war was inevitable. It was bound to happen sooner or later. To confront the power with the world's largest naval force, the Japanese were not foolish enough to fight head-on. Instead, they needed a sucker punch, a sneak attack. But where the chosen name was Pearl Harbor, located west of Honolulu on the island of Oahu in the North Pacific, Pearl Harbor is the most famous historical site of the Hawaiian archipelago. Due to its prime location since 1940, Pearl Harbor was used by the Americans as the main base of the Pacific Fleet, concentrating surface forces, submarines, and the fleet's air force. At that time, the Pacific Fleet was considered the strongest fleet in the world, with a total of more than 170 warships of various types, 8 battleships, 6 cruisers, 32 destroyers, and 5 aircraft carriers with over 400 military aircraft. Protecting the fleet in the entire archipelago were 4,300 soldiers and officers equipped with the most modern weapons. That is not to mention the logistics forces such as oil depots, ammunition dumps, and maintenance facilities built densely across the island. Thanks to its solid defenses, garrison forces, and natural characteristics, Pearl Harbor could be considered the strongest fortress in the world. From this base, the U.S. Navy could control the entire North Pacific region, reaching Japan, New Zealand, and Southeast Asia. Since it was 437 kilometers from the Japanese mainland, Americans never bothered to think that the Samurai Army would target this remote base.
They can't reach us.
However, American calculations could not match Japanese calculations. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, was the one who devised the plan to attack Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto's intention was to neutralize the Pacific Fleet so that other Japanese forces could freely seize all of East Asia, creating a basis for negotiation with the U.S. in a direction favorable to his homeland. To do that, the Japanese side deployed a deeply insidious double game. On one hand, they continued to participate in negotiation sessions, showing a spirit of goodwill. On the other hand, they silently prepared weapons for their attack. The attack included 2 air raids, in which 3 main types of aircraft were used respectively. The Mitsubishi A6M0 fighter type 11 maximum speed up to 545 kilometers per hour, equipped with 1 20mm machine gun and 2 60 kilograms bombs under the wings. The Aichi D-3A dive bomber Val type 99 maximum speed of 450 kilometers per hour, range of 1 400 kilometers, equipped with 1 250 kilograms bomb under the fuselage and 2 60 kilograms bombs under the wings. The Nakajima B-5N torpedo bomber Kate type 97 maximum speed of 360 kilometers per hour, equipped with 1 Mk91 457 millimeters torpedo or 1 800 kilograms bomb under the fuselage. According to Yamamoto's calculations, the first wave would be a preemptive strike, with the main targets being battleships and aircraft carriers, in addition to Ford Island and air bases such as Wheeler, Hickam, Barber Point, Kaneohe. The second wave would be to clean up whatever remained. On the 26th of November 1941, from Kure Naval Base, a Japanese task force, Kido Butai, consisting of the fleet's 6 strongest aircraft carriers with over 400 aircraft 2 heavy cruisers, and 6 tankers under the command of Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo set off leaving northern Japan for a location northwest of Hawaii. To ensure secrecy, Admiral Yamamoto ordered the sinking of any vessels encountered en route if they met a U.S. ship before December 6th, the operation would be canceled. Fortunately, during the entire 10-day journey, the Japanese forces did not encounter a single ship. At 3:30 a.m. on December 7, the convoy reached the designated point 300 kilometers north of Pearl Harbor. The wake-up order was issued. All members of Kido Butai prepared for combat. From 2 heavy cruisers, 2 HE-13A1 seaplanes were launched to scout the weather. Following closely, 2 Nakajima A-8N seaplanes were launched southward to scout for the entire fleet. They brought back some extremely valuable information. The U.S. military was completely immobile. Under the dim light of dawn, waves crashed heavily against the shore. At exactly 6:00 a.m., the legendary Z-flag Zulu was officially hoisted on the flagship Akagi. This was the flag that Admiral Togo had used in the Battle of Tsushima to sink the Russian Imperial fleet in 1905. The mission commander, Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, tied a white band around his head to signify the fight to the death spirit of the Bushido tradition, stepping into the cockpit of his bomber. At exactly 6:20 a.m., the launch order was given. On the runways of 6 aircraft carriers, 183 aircraft of the first attack wave were in position. The entire fleet took off in record time, the roar echoing across the sky. The planes formed a V formation, proceeding one after another at a speed of 231 kilometers per hour. When they approached Oahu, a U.S. Army SCR-270 radar station located at Opana Point detected them and broadcast a warning. However, by coincidence, at this precise moment, the U.S. base was also expecting a flight of B-17 bombers reinforcing from the mainland, so they thought it was a training exercise. From an altitude of 3,500 meters, the Japanese aircraft flew amidst a sea of dense clouds, causing the pilots unavoidable anxiety. It wasn't until about 7:40 a.m. when the sky had cleared that Fuchida joyfully realized Pearl Harbor was right in sight. True to the plan, he had the entire squadron circle the northwest coast to approach the target. Through binoculars, all the soldiers were incredibly excited to see 8 battleships lined up perfectly straight: Oklahoma, Maryland, West Virginia, Tennessee, Arizona, Vestal, Nevada, and California, all beasts of the U.S. Navy. Additionally, there were many other cruisers and destroyers. The only pity was that there wasn't a single aircraft carrier. At 7:48 a.m., Fuchida broadcast the code 222 with a black signal flare shot. The attack officially began. The Nakajima B-5N torpedo planes quickly approached enemy warships. The Aichi D-3A dive bombers split into 2 groups. The first group attacked nearby airfields to prevent the U.S. Air Force from counterattacking. The remaining group attacked the warships. Unable to arrange a formation, the Mitsubishi A-6M0s were also ordered to attack the airfields. At 7:53 a.m., just before the first bomb fell on Pearl Harbor, the code Tora, Tora, Tora was sent, signifying that the air raid had achieved complete surprise. Sailors on the U.S. warships woke up to alarms and the sky-shattering explosions of bombs. Those still groggy hurriedly put on clothes and rushed to battle stations. The famous telegram, "Air Raid Pearl Harbor. This is not drill," was sent to headquarters. The Japanese really knew how to pick their timing. Today was the weekend, and a significant portion of the soldiers had gone to services at churches. The American side had absolutely no precautions. At that time, they still maintained neutrality in World War II. Ammunition depots were still locked, guns were not in combat-ready positions, planes were parked close together out in the open, and artillery batteries were unmanned. The leading Kate torpedo bombers, equipped with 800 kilograms armor-piercing bombs, attacked the battleships en masse. The battleship Oklahoma at the head of the line barely had time to start up before taking 2 consecutive torpedo hits and a series of cluster bombs, causing water to flood every compartment. Subsequent torpedoes hit the USS Utah, which had served the U.S. Navy for 33 years and had been stripped of weapons to serve as a target ship. The flagship Pennsylvania, though sitting in dry dock, was not spared. It was gifted 2 consecutive bombs from the air. Because the harbor was only about 10 meters deep, the U.S. forces had complacently not deployed anti-torpedo nets around the warships. Exploiting this, the Japanese devised an incredibly clever attack method. They had planes fly low over the water's surface, then launch torpedoes at a rapid pace of about 30 to 42 knots into enemy ships. Within 5 minutes, 4 battleships were hit by torpedoes. The battleship Oklahoma sank completely. Of the 400 sailors on board, not a single one survived. Although it escaped the torpedoes, the battleship USS Arizona was bombed 5 times. At 8:10 a.m., a bomb weighing over 800 kilograms pierced the deck and landed in its forward ammunition magazine. The ship exploded, breaking in 2, killing all 1102 sailors on board. On the other side, the two battleships, Tennessee and Maryland, were hit by two armor-piercing bombs, respectively. California and West Virginia were sunk. Nevada lay on the outside. Thanks to the alertness of the sailors and some luck, as its boilers had been kept warm, it almost escaped the attack while trying to maneuver out of the harbor. However, fate often plays cruel tricks. Spotted by Japanese planes, it took a full hit of two armor-piercing bombs, 4 regular bombs, and 1 torpedo, ending up beached at the harbor entrance. The invincible battleships of the Pacific Fleet, the pride and majesty of the U.S. Navy, were one by one picked apart by the flock of iron birds of the Japanese Air Force. Attacked completely by surprise, the U.S. forces were still able to launch some counterstrikes. Mess Attendant Third Class Doris Miller on the USS West Virginia, after being hit by a torpedo, went to the bridge to operate a .50 caliber Browning anti-aircraft gun, firing until the very last rounds at enemy aircraft. Kenneth Taylor and George Welch, who were still groggy, rushed to waiting Curtiss P-40 Tomahawk fighters, shooting down a total of 7 Japanese planes. But all this was just the beginning. At exactly 8:54 a.m., 171 aircraft in the second air raid wave began screaming across the sky. This time it was the turn of the battle cruisers and destroyers to suffer. Helena took a torpedo right at the start of the second wave. Phoenix caught fire, and Raleigh had a massive hole blown in its side by a torpedo. Honolulu luckily escaped death and continued to spit anti-aircraft fire. Destroyers were successively attacked, capsizing and having armor-piercing bombs slammed straight into their ammunition magazines. The situation at the airfields was even worse. The 2nd Squadron furiously strafed Ford Island and the Bellows Field air bases of the U.S. Army Air Forces. Pilots thought they were in a drill, and only when the D-3 Az dove down with the Japanese Naval Air Force insignia did they fully wake from their dream. All fighter jets on the airfield were locked and parked neatly in rows, becoming easy prey for the rockets of the Zeros. Seaplanes lined up neatly at Kaneohe burned fiercely. Pilots and ground crew below tried to shoot at anything they could fire, from rifles and pistols to submachine guns. Anti-aircraft fire began to be reorganized and had respectable power. However, being fired chaotically without any procedure, it did not cause too much damage. In just a few minutes, Wheeler, Hickam, and Barber Point air bases were all terribly devastated by the Japanese. Besides the air raid, the Japanese Navy also carefully positioned submarines around Oahu, cutting off any escape route for ships lucky enough to survive the artillery barrage. However, the attack by sea was not very successful. 1 Japanese submarine ran aground and drifted onto the beach, resulting in 1 sailor being taken prisoner. The grueling, uneven battle lasted for 90 minutes. An additional 20 Japanese aircraft were shot down, 4 midget submarines were sunk, and 64 men were killed. But that was nothing compared to the colossal damage the U.S. had to endure in less than 2 hours, nearly 20 U.S. Warships were damaged, over 300 aircraft were destroyed, 2403 military personnel and civilians were killed, and 2 others were injured. The thunderous blow that the Japanese landed unexpectedly on the morning of the 7th awakened a sleeping giant, causing President Franklin Roosevelt to declare in anger a date which will live in infamy. A series of newspapers immediately splashed the Pearl Harbor event on their front pages. The whole world was shocked. The position of the mighty Pacific Fleet was strangled. The fortress of Oahu, thought to be inviolable, turned out not to be as inviolable and strong as Army Chief of Staff George Marshall had imagined. This was absolutely a massive seismic event. While sitting on the sidelines profiting from the arms trade, the U.S. officially jumped into World War II, confronting the fascist powers. The Japanese Navy had won a resounding victory at Pearl Harbor, but they made a mistake by not rooting out the problem completely. No U.S. aircraft carriers were destroyed. Ship repair yards, oil depots, and ammunition dumps remained intact. The Japanese would soon have to pay the price for their arrogant actions. After the Battle of Pearl Harbor, a U.S. congressional committee conducted an extensive investigation into the disaster. Was this a calculated sacrifice by the U.S. government? Among the conclusions drawn, one stated that U.S. forces had focused too much on training to the point that they were blind to a possible attack. U.S. military commanders were so worried about sabotage that they locked up all anti-aircraft ammunition instead of distributing it to firing points. The Navy failed to maintain aerial patrols at sea due to a lack of equipment. However, the more they investigated, the more mysteries and inexplicable things were discovered. Many agreed that this was indeed a calculated sacrifice by President Roosevelt. Although the U.S. government called this a surprise attack by Japan, officials believed that President Roosevelt knew very well about this attack. In World War II, the U.S. had seen that the ceaseless growth of the Axis powers in general and the influence of Japanese fascism in East Asia in particular would be a terrible scenario for the U.S. once all allies were crushed across the European and Asian fronts. The U.S. wanted to jump into the war. However, at home, this did not receive public support. Therefore, the U.S. deliberately backed Japan into a corner to then utilize Pearl Harbor to legitimize its ambitions. In the book titled Day of Deceit, The Truth About FDR, and Pearl Harbor scholar Robert Stinnett of the Independent Institute in Oakland, California, USA, offered another hypothesis after studying classified documents provided to the investigative committees of both houses of the U.S. Congress regarding the attack on the Pearl Harbor base. According to this, about 11 months before the ambush occurred, Admiral Husband Kimmel, commander of the Pacific Fleet, along with Vice Admiral James Richardson, had warned the Pentagon about the possibility of the Japanese attacking Pearl Harbor on the Hawaiian archipelago, which is also the only U.S. state located in the ocean, making support from the mainland difficult. Their information was based on reports from U.S. naval intelligence planted on Japanese soil under the operation codename Magic. By the 7th of November 1941, 1 month before the attack, Admiral Harold Stark from the Pentagon wired back to the Pacific Fleet Command, agreeing with the assessment that the situation in the region was gradually developing into a crisis. A week later, the next dispatch clearly stated the view that the United States would prefer Japan to attack first. Simultaneously, this telegram also requested Admiral Kimmel to cease all intelligence activities related to the Magic case, as well as to take measures to evacuate ships to avoid major losses. Thus, 2 aircraft carriers, 6 cruisers, and 14 expensive torpedo boats were evacuated from Pearl Harbor on Hawaii to Midway and Wake Islands, hundreds of nautical miles away. To reinforce this assessment, analysts also argued there is no reason why advanced U.S. radar could not detect 6 Japanese warships carrying 400 aircraft parked 350 kilometers away from the target. Especially on the evening of the 6th of December, 1941, just before the day Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt convened a rare meeting attended by high-level war advisors, including Secretary of the Navy Knox, Chief of Naval, Operations Stark Secretary of War Stimson, and Intelligence Advisor Harry Hopkins. The atmosphere in the Oval Office was extremely heavy. It seemed they were waiting for something about to happen to the U.S. Pacific Naval Forces at Pearl Harbor. Even after the attack suspicion was pushed to a climax when Navy Secretary Knox told his close friend James Steinman that he was holding the biggest secret in history. What is your opinion on this matter? Was it the U.S. or Japan that truly held the initiative at Pearl Harbor?